Putin is also going to be faced with this tough political decision. Does he start sending people whom he's essentially dragooning into a war with all the political disruption that that involves, or does he scale down his offensive operations?
Ukraine's President Zelensky meets President Trump at his Mar-a-Lago, Florida home for crucial talks to try and bring an end to the war with Russia. The two leaders are expected to discuss if a demilitarized zone could be set up in the Donbass region, as well as other sticking points. But the Russia specialist Mark Galeotti writes in the Sunday Times today that it's exhaustion rather than political agreement that may ultimately bring an end to the war. Mark joins us now. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
The peace deal is going to be discussed, we know, between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And we hope that Trump feels that there is something to it in order to be meeting Zelensky in the first place. But you say actually one of the bigger factors here, whilst all this goes on, whilst peace negotiations go on, is exhaustion and manpower or people power on the ground in this war.
Yes, I mean, look, one can hope that in fact it is possible to reach a negotiated settlement over the war, but I must admit, at the moment, I'm not feeling especially optimistic about that. But either way, my view is that it's hard to see, even without any peace process, the war continuing the current tempo and intensity for another year. Both sides are feeling exhaustion, and indeed, frankly, to a degree, so too is the European Union, which is, after all, the main power bankrolling the Ukrainians at the moment. So there is a sense, and maybe this is just trying to look for a little bit of silver lining in the cloud of my rather negative appreciation of the peace process, is that one way or the other, the war will change in the coming year.
OK, let's talk about what each side, as it were, has on the ground in terms of personnel. You look at two key issues, really, conscription for Ukrainians and whether Putin should mobilise reservists. Just talk us through those, because both those aspects are key to making sure that there's enough power on the ground.
Sure, because let's face it, even in today's drone age, drones cannot entirely substitute for the poor bloody infantryman sort of shivering away in a foxhole somewhere. And both sides are actually finding in different ways trouble actually keeping the supply of manpower. I mean, the Ukrainian forces are overextended and exhausted. I mean, one of the problems they face is they're so thinly scattered along the line that particularly when, for whatever reason, drones aren't in the air because of bad weather or jamming or whatever, then often these small Russian assault groups can just literally walk between these scattered defensive positions without even being seen. The problem is, after all, that Ukraine is having to maintain a civilian economy, which also includes the defense industrial, all the production of these huge numbers of drones and such like that they're using, and at the same time find more warm bodies to send to the front. And that process is increasingly becoming the so-called bussification, almost a kind of a process of press ganging people off the streets. There are further options. Zelensky could reduce the age of conscription and so forth, but these all carry political costs with them. And political cost is also what Russia faces. Up to now, Putin has managed to avoid the kind of protests that we've seen in past wars, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Russia's wars in Chechnya, by not using conscripts. In other words, by using volunteers who are offered eye-watering sums of money in order to volunteer to serve. And the rest of Russian society tends to think, well, almost that they playing a particularly bloody lottery. It's their choice. It's getting harder and harder to find the money, but also to find the recruits. They managed it this year. They're recruiting about at least 30,000 each month, which makes up for their losses. But there's real questions as to whether that can continue in the coming year, when the economy is also sliding into recession, if not stagnation. So Putin is also going to be faced with this tough political decision. Does he start sending people whom he's essentially dragooning into a war with all the political disruption that that involves, or does he scale down his offensive operations?
So for Russia, it is about whether there is enough money there to keep tempting reservists into frontline duty. For Ukraine, it is more about appetite, isn't it? And will, let's say that that the country does or is the beneficiary of those frozen Russian assets, and they get a huge a sort of wedge of cash thrown their way so that they have got money to kit out personnel. Where do they find the personnel from? Is the only option to lower the age of conscription, or do Ukraine look at what Russia has done and offer a healthy amount of money to try and entice young people to the front line?
Well, that's certainly one possibility, and certainly something that has been mooted, that actually some of this European money ought to be spent on that, because at the moment, essentially, Ukrainian soldiers, they haven't received any kind of a pay rise in any meaningful sense since the start of the war. But when it comes down to it, look, this is a country which, depending on how you count it, a quarter to a third of its population has fled and is left and is largely now scattered around the rest of the world. I mean, this is actually a much smaller country in population terms than Russia. So that even if you start tinkering with the age of conscription and the like, there is still going to be a problem, just simply not enough people to be able to cope with, after all, fighting along a 1,200-kilometre front line. And also maintaining some sort of degree of quality of life in the rest of the country. And you talk about kitting out. I mean, there is this almost sense that you can basically win a war on Amazon Prime, that once you have the money, you can get the stuff delivered quickly. It's often not the case. I mean, actually, if the Europeans, for example, are going to be providing more kit, not just the money, well, it's going to take a long time to ramp up production in many crucial areas.
To procure it, of course.
Exactly. So I think this is all a problem.
And the peace process, or any peace agreement Zelensky has pledged, would need to go to a referendum of the Ukrainian people. How does appetite for frontline duty, war weariness, the reservations of young men and women to put their lives in danger, how does that pay into the peace plan? Does it make it more likely that a referendum is positive in favour of a peace plan simply because Ukrainians don't have the appetite to continue with war?
Well, I mean, here we have to recognise the extraordinary determination that the Ukrainians have shown up to now. And it's very hard to tell, because obviously people have tried to do polling on the attitudes of Ukrainians. But, until there's a real deal, this is all somewhat sort of fantasy polling in a way. And we're getting very, frankly, contradictory results. One point that must be made, though, is Zelensky is now looking, although, again, he's still unassailed, but nonetheless, he's looking weaker as a leader, particularly since his right-hand man, Andriy Yermak, his chief of staff, was forced to resign in the middle of some very problematic corruption allegations. And so there is also a question as to actually how strong Zelensky will be in carrying the country with him if he puts his personal weight behind a referendum. So I think these are all the reasons why, along with the very, very intractable issue of what happens to that remaining fifth of the Donetsk region, that Putin is still demanding, which is why, although Zelensky says 90% of the issues have been sorted, and he may well be right, those remaining 10% still look pretty improbable to actually be resolved this time round.
Yeah, and there's those security guarantees, which are also the issue as well. And of course, anything agreed by Zelensky and Donald Trump will need to go back to Putin, of course. It feels a little way away, but still progress is being made, we hope. Mark Galeotti, thank you for your assessments. Really good to be joined by you. The Russia specialist, Mark Galeotti. He's written in the Sunday Times today. You can find that at thetimes.com and, of course, in today's paper. Thanks, Mark.